all of the things that the premillennialists have used, the scriptures that they have used to put together this whole idea of the tribulation, the coming tribulation, most of that comes from a passage in Matthew 24, where Jesus is actually responding to some questions that the disciples have asked him. Okay, so we're going to look at the questions right here. So this is Matthew 24, verse 3. And as Jesus was sitting on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately saying, "Tell us, when will these things happen, and what will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age?" So if you notice, the disciples were actually asking three different questions, okay? So now the premillennialists, the futurists, assume that all three of these questions are about the end of the age. But it's not until they get to the last question that they even mention the end of the age. So if you read the first question, they say, "Tell us, Jesus, when will these things happen?" So we don't know what these things are. What are they talking about? We got to go back a few verses to see what they're talking about. So now if we go back to the previous chapter, Matthew 23, we see there the whole chapter, Jesus and the disciples were in the temple. And this is that famous passage where Jesus tells off the Pharisees. Okay, this is where Jesus calls the Pharisees a brood of vipers. He calls them whitewashed tombs who look good on the outside, inside are full of corruptions and death. Okay, and so he the whole chapter, he's going off on the Pharisees. Okay, and the disciples are seeing all of this. And at the very end, he says this: "Therefore, behold, I am sending you prophets and wise men and scribes. Some of them you, Pharisees, will kill and crucify." He's talking about himself because they're getting ready to crucify him. And then he says, basically, the blood of all of these people through the whole Old Testament and today is on you, Pharisees, and you will be punished. And here's how he ends it. He says, "Truly I say to you, all these things will come upon this generation." Okay, now I put these things in red because that's the same phrase, the same words that the disciples asked Jesus 3 verses later. When will these things happen? So they're talking about what Jesus said here, okay? And notice Jesus said this, all this stuff that's going to happen, your punishment, it's going to happen in this generation. Remember that. That's going to be important. We're going to talk about that again in a minute. Okay, so that's the end of Matthew chapter 23. Now we go to Matthew chapter 24, and verse 3 is where those questions are. So here's verse 1 and 2. Jesus left the temple area, was going on his way when his disciples came up to point out the temple buildings to him. But he responded and said, so the disciples following after Jesus, and they're like, "Jesus, look at this temple. It's probably the biggest building they've ever seen." And Jesus turns around and he says, "Do you not see all these things? Truly, I say to you, not one stone here will be left upon another, which will not be torn down." So he tells them, first of all, he uses that same phrase, "these things." And then he tells them this crazy, shocking thing. This amazing temple that you think is so great, this is going to totally be destroyed. It's going to be so destroyed that not even two stones will be standing on top of one another. So this is a shocking thing that Jesus tells the disciples. And it's immediately after he says that they say, "Jesus, tell us, when will these things happen?" Okay, so they are obviously, when you look at it in context, they are not asking about the end of the age. They're asking about when is the temple going to be destroyed, what Jesus has just told them. Okay, so now they might, in their minds, the disciples might think that's the end of the age because they can't imagine anything as horrible as the temple being destroyed. But Jesus knows the temple is going to be destroyed in AD70 in 40 years. Okay, and that is definitely not the end of the age. So Jesus immediately begins answering their question. So, but the first thing that we want, and I'm going to talk about the other two questions after this, but the first thing we want to look at is, I want to remind you that the temple indeed was destroyed, just like Jesus said, and it was destroyed in AD 70. So remember, Jesus had said, this is going to happen in this generation. And it did, because 40 years later, the entire temple was burned down. All of Jerusalem was destroyed when 20,000 Roman soldiers descended upon Jerusalem. And they so destroyed and burned down the temple that there were no two stones standing on top of one another. So Jesus's prophecy came true in crazy matching fashion within 40 years. That was indeed in the same generation as the people that he told this prophecy to. All right, so now let's look at his answer to the first question, because he does start answering that question right away. So here's what he says. Now, I went through verse by verse back in November, and I'm not going to do that now. I'm just going to kind of give you a list of all the things that he says. Okay, so remember, Jesus is answering their question, when will the temple be destroyed? And so he gives them a whole list of things. These are the signs that will indicate to you that the temple is getting ready to be destroyed. So he's giving them this list of things. And so what I talked about in November was all of these things in this list actually did happen. Very, very exactly, shockingly, exactly the same as Jesus predicted. And so now the premillennialist, the futurists, believe that this list that Jesus gives next is a list of things that are going to happen in our future, in this coming tribulation. But I think it's very clear if you go through it and look at it all in context that Jesus is not talking about something that is going to happen 2,000 plus years from when he said it. He's talking about something that's going to happen within 40 years. And here are the things that he says to look for. He says, many will claim to be Christ. He says there will be wars, famines, and earthquakes. There will be persecution. There will be apostasy and false prophets. The gospel will be preached to all nations. Now, let me just mention this because this trips a lot of people up. So as we talked about, I think it's pretty clear all these other things were happening. But this one, people get a little, they're like, oh, there you go. It's got to be something that happens way in the future because the gospel has not been preached to all nations. But as I talked about in November, the phrase that is used for all nations is actually most often used to speak of the civilized world. So what Jesus was talking about, all nations, he was talking about the Roman Empire. Because at this time, when Jesus was on earth, the Roman Empire was pretty much in control of the entire civilized world. Okay, so it's not all nations as we understand today. And then there are some instances in Peter's letters, Paul's letters, and John's letters where they indicate that they believed in their lifetime that the gospel had already been preached to all nations. And what they were talking about was these nations that were under part of the Roman Empire. Okay, so there you go. Abomination of desolation. Okay, so the premillennialists believe that this is talking about the Antichrist. Okay, so but if you read Luke's version of this story, because Luke tells this same story where the disciples ask this question and Jesus answers, Luke does not say abomination of desolation. Luke says the abomination of the soldiers when you see the soldiers surrounding Israel. So that is the abomination he's talking about. And if you compare those two, it makes it clear. And that is what happened before the Roman soldiers descended upon Israel. Okay, Great Tribulation. Over 1 million Jewish people were murdered when the Roman soldiers came in. So that is a Great Tribulation. And false Christ. And then this last weird thing that Jesus said, he ends all of this with, he says, where the corpse is, there the vultures will gather. And so in one way you can think, okay, well, that's obvious. If there were more than 1 million Jewish people killed, then obviously there was going to be a lot of corpses and there would be vultures. So, but there's one other thing that's so fascinating. So Jerusalem is surrounded by mountains. Okay, and so what the Roman soldiers would do before they would attack a city, they would surround the city. And so in this case with Jerusalem, they were standing around the tops of the mountains. So everyone in Jerusalem could look up and they could see these Roman soldiers all around the city. And the Roman soldiers would hold these banners that they called standards. And it was a method of intimidation to get into the minds of the people they were getting ready to attack. And what do you think? What picture was on these banners? Here's the picture. The two-headed black vultures. So it's so interesting that Jesus says, where the corpse is, there the vultures will gather, because the vultures gathered all around Jerusalem, and they were getting ready to turn Jerusalem into a corpse. Okay, so it's just crazy. It's so clear to me how perfectly it matches everything Jesus said. I believe so perfectly matches when Jerusalem was destroyed in AD 70. So I do not believe for one second that Jesus was talking about something coming 2,000 plus years in the future from when Jesus said it. This is something that I believe happened within the first generation, as he said. All right, so let's look at the. Make sure I didn't get out of order. Okay, yeah, here's these same scriptures about the generation. Remember, he said that before. He said it to the Pharisees. Okay, in Matthew 23, and we just looked at that. He says, these things will come upon this generation. Well, he says it again. After he gives that long list of things that he says are going to happen, he says, truly, I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. All right, so this was the thing that back when I started studying all of this for myself, I was really disturbed by this. When I was studying the Bible for myself, first started studying it, and I read that Jesus said this, and I knew I was still a premillennialist back then, and I knew that these were all these things that they were telling me, these are things that are going to happen, haven't even happened to us yet. Then why does Jesus say this is going to happen in your generation? Is Jesus just lying? Jesus doesn't lie. So I just assumed I didn't understand. Then I read this book a couple of years ago and he didn't lie because this really did happen. All this stuff did happen to that generation. So anyway, to me, this was like the clincher. I'm like, oh, this is absolutely true. That's what changed my mind. Okay, so let's go to the next question. Question number 2. All right, so we're going back to the questions in verse 3. So the next thing they say is, what will be the sign of your coming? Okay, so now the premillennialists, they believe that the disciples are asking Jesus about the second coming, when he's going to come back. But my argument, and partial preterists say that, how can that be? Okay, it doesn't make any logical sense that the disciples would be asking about Jesus' second coming, because at this point, when they're saying this, they don't even know Jesus is going to die. They don't know Jesus is going to leave. As far as they know, Jesus, he's there to stay. They have no idea. Why would they ask him about the second coming? So no, what they are actually asking him. So there are several places in the Old Testament and in the New Testament where the same phrase is used, like the coming of the Son of Man. And it is used to talk about, in particular in Daniel, there's a prophecy that says the coming of the Son of Man. And the Jewish people believed that they interpreted those prophecies to mean that the Messiah was going to come and set up a physical kingdom on earth. And so the disciples believe that at this time. So when they say, what is the sign of your coming? They're asking him, they're not saying, when are you coming back, Jesus? They're asking him, when will you step into your kingdom and reveal yourself as king? This is what they're waiting for. They've been following Jesus around and watching him do all these crazy miracles. They knew what he was capable of. So they're assuming any moment he's going to, zap the Romans and set up his kingdom, and they're going to reign with him. So they were looking for a physical kingdom. So that's what they're asking. And so look how Jesus answers it. So the way he answers it, that this is what the premillennialists take. This passage here is where they come up with the rapture event idea, scenario. Okay. So here's what Jesus says. He starts off and says, but immediately after the tribulation of those days. So he's just been talking about when Jerusalem is destroyed in AD 70. Okay. And immediately, not 2,000 years in the future, immediately that after that, the sun will be darkened and the moon will not give its light and the stars will fall from the sky and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. Okay. So the premillennialists, they take all of this literally. They envision some kind of nuclear holocaust. They think that this is going to be something, where there's going to be some nuclear holocaust and it's going to make the sky dark and it'll seem like the stars have fallen, all of this. But this is actually a Hebrew saying. It's like a metaphorical, common way that the Hebrews would talk about the fall of a great empire. So back in December, when I did my podcast, I showed a bunch of examples of this where they were talking about like the fall of Babylon, and they talked about the sun grew dark. And then the fall of Egypt, the sky was rolled up as a scroll. They use this very metaphorical language to discuss the fall of a great empire. And so Jesus is talking about the fall of Israel here. Okay. And then he says this, then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in the sky. All the tribes of the earth will mourn. They will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of the sky with power and great glory. He will send forth his angels with great trumpet blast, and they will gather together his elect from the four winds and from one end of the sky to the other. So we can see how the premillennialists are getting this rapture event scenario from this description. But I don't believe that's the correct interpretation of what he's saying. So one thing to know is that every place where you see sky, That is the Greek word that also means heaven. So if you replace sky with heaven, then that changes the way you think, because when you say sky, you think the blue sky and clouds and all of that. So, but what Jesus was actually talking about was when he came into his kingdom in heaven. When Jesus went back up, when he ascended back to heaven and sat on his throne next to God, that is when Jesus came into his kingdom. And then he sent the Holy Spirit so that the kingdom of heaven was still on earth in us, in the body of Christ, because now Jesus, as the Holy Spirit, is living on earth within every single believer in Jesus Christ. So that is when Jesus came into his kingdom. So right here, Jesus is talking about spiritual things. He's talking about a spiritual kingdom. He's not talking about physical things. And so to interpret this as physical things, we make the same mistake that the Jewish people did when they were expecting Jesus to set up a physical kingdom the first time he came. The first time he came was not physical. It was a spiritual kingdom. We are living in a time where it is a spiritual kingdom. It is not a physical kingdom. And if you look at all of this in context, it's clear that he's talking about something that happened right after Jerusalem was destroyed. All right. And then he ends it right here with that verse. Truly, I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. So, and that's exactly what I believe happened. All right, let's look at the last question, and then we will move on to Daniel. All right, this is the third question. So back to that verse that has the questions. So finally, by the third question, the disciples actually ask about the end of the age. They say, and what about the end of the age? And here's how Jesus answers them. Okay, he says, heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. But about that day and hour, about the end of the age, no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, nor the Son, but the Father alone. So notice how his language changes. So the whole beginning, first 3/4 of this chapter, Jesus is saying, here's exactly what's going to happen. Here's the signs. Here are the things to watch out for. He knew exactly every detail about what was getting ready to happen when the temple was destroyed. But then when he starts talking about the end of the age, he says, oh, the end of the age, nobody knows. I don't even know. Nobody knows. So it's very obvious that he's not talking about the same time. So when he gets to this point, finally, we agree with the premillennialists about something, because we believe, partial preterists believe, that what Jesus is saying here he's talking about something that has not happened yet. It is when he is going to return, his second coming. Okay, and so after that, then he spends all this time talking about, well, since you don't know and nobody knows when the end of the age is coming, you need to be ready. You need to be ready at all times. So he says it's going to be like the coming of the Son of Man is going to be just like the days of Noah, because everybody was eating and drinking and marrying, and they had no idea that anything was coming until the water started coming down. So, and then he gives 4 parables, and the message of each parable is the same. It is be ready. You need to be ready. You need to have oil in your lamp. You need to take advantage of this time that you are given right now and live the way you should, because you do not know when the Son of Man is coming. Then after that, he ends by giving this long thing about the great white throne judgment day. And we're going to talk more about that when we get into Revelation. So I'm not going to talk about that right now.